Hey guys, in today's video, I bring you an impressive and chilling story. Let's meet Gideon Rourke, a skeptical truck driver who literally died during a blizzard and came back to life after 35 minutes, clinically dead. But most incredible is what he saw on the other side: prophetic visions of natural disasters, an impending spiritual battle, and an urgent message about humanity's destiny in March 2025. What he discovered in the spiritual corridor will leave you speechless. So before we start, leave your like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content like this, and activate the bell to receive all notifications. Now, get ready for this intense and surprising journey. My name is Gideon Rourke, and if anyone had met me before the winter of 2018, they would describe me as the kind of man who believed in nothing other than what he saw in front of the windshield of my truck. I spent most of my life on the road, a lone truck driver, driving my old Peterbilt 379 on routes that crisscrossed the United States from coast to coast. It was a hard life, but I liked the predictable routine: drive, unload, reload, and move on to the next destination. There was no room for philosophies, religions, or theories about life after death. For me, heaven was just what I saw through the glass, and hell was a delayed load on a blocked road. That night the weather was especially treacherous. I was on Interstate 93, crossing northern Montana, and the blizzard had turned the world into a white blur. Every kilometer covered felt like a small victory, but there was something strange in the air. The cold was biting, and even with the heater on full blast, I couldn't get warm. A feeling of oppression began to grow in my chest, first like a hand squeezing my heart, then like a crushing fist. I kept my hands tight on the steering wheel, trying to ignore the pain. "Not now," I muttered to myself, as if I could bargain with my own body. But my left arm began to tingle, my vision narrowed, and the ringing in my ear became a deafening roar. Survival instinct made me pull over the truck, pulling the handbrake with the last of my strength. When I managed to open the door and get out, the cold air invaded my lungs like 1,000 knives. I took 2 steps before my legs gave out. Kneeling in the snow, I felt the cold damp seep through my pants. Each breath was a monumental effort. I remember looking up at the sky, where the heavy clouds blocked any sign of hope. The snow fell slowly, each flake like a point of light in the growing darkness. And then, the world went dark. When darkness took over me, I expected nothingness to be eternal. I always imagined that death would be a turning off of lights, like a switch that goes off without ceremony. But what happened was the opposite of that. I opened my eyes, but they weren't my physical eyes. The first thing I saw was my own body, lying in the snow, surrounded by a white layer that was beginning to cover me like an icy blanket. My skin was pale, almost bluish, and my lips had lost all color. It was a bizarre, almost mesmerizing sight, and I felt no fear, just a strange curiosity. I floated. I don't know how else to describe it. There was no heaviness in me, no cold, no pain. It felt as if I were made of air, a consciousness loose in the world. I looked around and saw every detail of the frozen scene. My truck with the engine still running, the headlights casting dim beams of light through the thick snow, the hot vapor escaping through the exhaust and quickly dissipating into the sharp air. Each falling snowflake seemed brighter, twinkling like little stars. There was a peace to it all, a feeling that time had slowed down, but at the same time, an invisible force began to pull me. It was as if an invisible thread was tied to my spirit, pulling me gently but firmly away from the scene. I tried to resist, not because I wanted to go back, but because I didn't understand what was happening. My own will didn't seem to matter. Little by little, the landscape around me began to distort. The snow, the truck, my fallen body, everything began to fall apart like fresh paint being washed away by rain. I was being dragged through a tunnel of light, a passage that seemed to extend beyond reality. There was no sound except a soft hum that intensified as I went. And then, the tunnel opened, and I found myself in a hallway. It was no ordinary hallway. The walls were made of ancient stones, covered in symbols I had never seen before. They glowed faintly, each seeming to contain a secret. I floated through that space, and the peace I had felt before began to mix with a sense of anticipation, as if something great was about to happen. As I moved through the ancient stone corridor, I began to realize that the environment around me was not static. The walls seemed to breathe, the symbols glowed in rhythmic patterns, as if following an invisible pulse. I didn't have a physical body, but I felt more present than ever. It was as if my essence was naked, exposed to everything that place had to offer. Suddenly, the corridor began to expand. The ancient stones fell away, revealing a vast expanse of scenery that unfolded before me like scenes from a movie. I was suspended in a space with no floor or ceiling, surrounded by visions that seemed more real than anything I had ever experienced in my life. The first vision cast me over a city I immediately recognized: New York. But it wasn't the vibrant, bright New York we all know. It was a city swallowed by a gigantic flood. Towers and skyscrapers became islands in a raging sea, and streets had turned into merciless rivers. I saw people running. Their screams were inaudible, but the despair on their faces was unmistakable. The waters advanced, taking cars, debris, and lives, without distinction. The scene changed abruptly, and now I was flying over a forest. The smell of smoke enveloped me, something that seemed impossible since I didn't have a physical body. The forest was on fire, and the horizon was a wall of fire. I recognized the landscapes of California, places I had already crossed on some of my trips as a truck driver. The flames devoured everything in their path. Animals fled, and the sky was covered by a curtain of ash. Before I could process it, I was catapulted into the heart of Tokyo. The ground shook, and I saw buildings crumble as if they were made of sand. The cracks in the streets opened and swallowed everything. Merciless and uncontrollable destruction. People fell, structures collapsed, and the feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. In the midst of all this devastation, something caught my attention. In the gray and turbulent sky, figures of light appeared. They were tall beings, with humanoid shapes, but enveloped in a golden luminosity that seemed to drive away the darkness. Around him, a shadow stirred, an oppressive, reptilian presence. This dark entity had no defined shape, but its eyes. Those eyes were red slits that exuded pure evil. The spiritual battle was unfolding before me. The light beings emanated peace and protection, while the dark entity promised power and forbidden knowledge. I knew without knowing how, that this fight was linked to a date: March 2025. This was the timeline where everything would be decided, where the world could be saved or damned. I didn't know my role in that. Was I just a spectator? A messenger? The questions consumed me, and the spiritual corridor around me seemed to respond, narrowing again, taking me back. Suddenly, the spiritual corridor began to collapse around me. The ancient stones cracked, and the soft light that illuminated the path was replaced by an overwhelming darkness. I felt myself being pulled back, not as gently as before, but with a raw, inescapable force. It was as if the universe itself was throwing me back into my body, into the physical world, where the cold and pain awaited me. I opened my eyes and was immediately struck by a sharp pain in my chest. The sharp Montana air filled my lungs like sharp blades. My vision was blurry, but I gradually made out the outline of a figure above me. It was a young woman, with dark hair and a determined expression. Her hands pressed my chest rhythmically, and her voice cut through the wind, ordering me to stay with her. "Come back, you will make it," she screamed, and each word seemed to pull me back into my body. I later discovered her name was Ella McCree, a nurse who was on her way to visit family and by divine chance or fate, found my truck parked on the side of the road. When she got closer, she saw my body almost buried in the snow. Without hesitation, he began CPR, even as his hands turned red and numb from the cold. I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, and soon other figures joined us. Police officers and paramedics worked tirelessly, and as my body trembled between life and death, I floated between the physical world and that spiritual corridor, seeing everything from an impossible angle. I remember hearing fragments of conversations. 35 minutes without a heartbeat. It won't come back. Miracle, just a miracle. And then, like a switch being flipped, I came back. My breathing came back with a sob. My eyes opened, and the pain that enveloped me was almost welcome. All around me, faces expressed shock and relief. Sheriff Dean Harper, a burly, strong-voiced man, stared at me as if I were a ghost. "In hell, how did you get back?" he murmured, taking off his hat and running his hand over his sweaty forehead. I had no answers, just a growing feeling that my life from now on would never be the same. The following days were shrouded in a fog of disbelief. At the hospital, doctors and nurses watched me as if I were a walking miracle. And actually, that's what everyone said. 35 minutes without a heartbeat. 35 minutes in which, by all medical standards, my brain should have suffered irreversible damage. However, there I was, lucid, speaking and, most impressively, without any after effects. Nurse Ella McCree didn't leave my side. She was more than my physical savior. It became an anchor in the rough sea in which my mind sailed. When I first woke up, I saw your eyes filled with unshakable faith, and perhaps it was this faith that kept me sane in the days that followed. "Do you realize what a miracle it is to be here, Gideon?" she asked one night, as the monotonous sound of the devices around me filled the room. I felt something while I was doing CPR, like a greater force was around us. I didn't know how to respond. Before my heart attack, I would have scoffed at any mention of miracles or spiritual forces, but the visions of the spiritual corridor, the apocalyptic scenes, and that battle between light and darkness were engraved in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them again. It wasn't a dream or delusion. I knew that. It was a truth, a message that needed to be shared. When I was finally discharged, coming home was not what I expected. My wife, Lisa, and my 2 children, Ben and Sarah, hugged me, but there was a distance between us. They were grateful that I was alive, but they didn't understand the man who had returned to them. I wasn't the same Gideon anymore. The simple things of everyday life seemed insignificant compared to the weight of the mission I felt I had been given. I started having vivid dreams, almost like I was being transported back to the spiritual corridor every night. I saw floods sweeping through cities, heard the crackle of flames consuming forests, and felt the earth tremble beneath my feet. And, always in the background, the spiritual battle continued, beings of light fighting against the dark entity, each confrontation echoing in my soul. It was Ella who suggested I start writing. "You need to get this out, Gideon. Maybe your words can help other people." With your encouragement, I created a blog. At first, my posts were tentative, almost apologetic in their prophetic tone. But as the dreams intensified and the real world began to reflect the visions, floods in distant countries, wildfires, devastating earthquakes, my words gained strength, and that's how Zane Waverly found me. His conspiracy theory podcast had a loyal following, and when he read my blog, he saw an opportunity. At first, I thought he just wanted an audience, but there was a sincerity in the way he spoke to me. "People need to hear this, Gideon. If you're right, the world needs to prepare." And so the skeptical truck driver became the reluctant messenger of the apocalypse. The following months were a whirlwind. I, who have always been a man of routine, found myself involved in a mission that I didn't even fully understand. My story has spread beyond the blog, thanks to the reach of Zane Waverly and his podcast. Initially, reactions were mixed. Some people considered me a lunatic, a freeloader, or just another conspiracy theorist. But as time passed, events in the real world began to echo my visions. In early 2024, a flood devastated a coastal city in Europe, exactly as I had described in one of my posts. News images showed buildings being swallowed by water, and the feeling of déjà vu was overwhelming. It wasn't just a coincidence. I knew that. Ella remained by my side, helping to respond to the emails and messages that arrived in droves. Many people sought spiritual guidance. Others just wanted to understand what was happening. Among them, Sheriff Dean Harper. He came to me one cold morning, his normally hard and skeptical face now tinged with concern. "Gideon, my wife had a strange dream, and it looked a lot like what you described," he said, his hands shaking, holding a cup of coffee. "She saw the earth shake, buildings falling, and a shadow, a dark thing. I knew what it was. The dark entity, the being that promised power and forbidden knowledge in exchange for submission to darkness. I saw that shadow in my dreams too, getting closer and closer, more and more real. As the days went by, my blog became a meeting point for those who felt that the world was changing. People shared their own spiritual visions and experiences. Some reported encounters with beings of light. Others spoke of nightmares with the dark entity. Little by little, a small community was formed, and with it, a mission to prepare as many people as possible for what was to come. March 2025 was quickly approaching. The world seemed on the verge of collapse, not just physical but spiritual. More violent storms, volcanoes awakening, conflicts around the globe. It was as if the planet itself was responding to the spiritual chaos that I knew was unfolding behind the scenes of reality. The pressure was mounting, and I often wondered if I was up to the challenge. The truck driver I had been, The simple and practical man seemed like a distant memory. Now I carried the weight of a prophecy, and each night, when I closed my eyes, I felt the spiritual corridor calling me again. As March 2025 approached, the tension in the air was almost palpable. Each news report seemed like a confirmation of the visions I had seen in the spirit corridor. The storms were more violent, the weather more unpredictable. Earthquakes shook the foundations of entire cities, and wildfires consumed regions that were once considered safe. I wasn't the only one to notice. People around the world were beginning to sense that something big was about to happen, even if they couldn't explain exactly what. I found myself surrounded by those who believed in my message. Ella became more than my ally. She was my rock. He organized online meetings, where people shared their spiritual experiences and sought guidance. Sheriff Dean Harper, who initially viewed everything with skepticism, began to help us, alerting the local community about the need for preparation, not just for physical disasters, but for the impending spiritual confrontation. Zane Waverly, ever the skilled communicator, began organizing live streams, connecting people around the world. In one such broadcast, a man from Indonesia reported seeing figures of light guiding people out of a city during a flood. A woman in Italy spoke of recurring dreams about a battle between glowing beings and a reptilian shadow. Just as I had described, my message was no longer just a voice in the desert. It became a global calling, but the darkness also responded. I started receiving threatening messages. Anonymous voices accused me of spreading fear, of being a charlatan. I received phone calls where heavy breathing was the only answer. One night, as I was reviewing my notes, I heard the window glass shatter. A rock crossed the room, and a word was painted in red on it. Shut up. Despite the fear, I knew I couldn't stop. It wasn't just about me. It was about everyone starting to wake up to the truth. The spiritual battle was getting closer, and the choice between light and darkness needed to be made by each soul. I felt it, not just in my dreams, but in the air itself. It was as if the veil between the worlds was thinning, about to tear, and then the calendar turned. It was March 1st, 2025, the first day of the month that would change everything. The clock of prophecy was ticking, and the world was about to face its greatest spiritual challenge. The first days of March brought an unsettling feeling. The mornings seemed darker, the air filled with a tension that made even the animals act strangely. Birds flew in chaotic patterns, dogs barked into the void, and even the trees seemed to bow under an invisible weight. I knew the spiritual battle had begun, even though it was still invisible to most people. The visions that haunted me in my sleep began to manifest themselves while I was awake as well. One afternoon, walking through the backyard, the world around me dissolved. Suddenly, I found myself in that spiritual corridor again, but now it was in ruins. The ancient stones cracked, and a dark mist crept across the ground like a black tide trying to swallow everything. And then I saw it. Beings of light fought fiercely against the dark entity. The luminous beings were tall and imposing, their forms vaguely human but enveloped in a golden aura. They brandished swords made of pure light, each strike dispelling the darkness around them. On the other side, the dark entity seemed to grow. His reptilian form lengthened. Tentacles of darkness spread across the spiritual battlefield, and where they touched, the light weakened. "Choose, Gideon," a voice echoed. It was soft but powerful, like the sound of a harp played by the wind. The battle is not just theirs, it's everyone's. Suddenly, I was back in my yard, on my knees in the cold earth, my hands covered in mud. My wife, Lisa, ran up to me, her face pale and her eyes wide. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You just stood there, staring into space." I knew I needed to act. I invited Ella, Zane, and Sheriff Dean Harper to a meeting that same night. As we sat around the kitchen table, I shared my vision, not just what I had seen, but what I felt. The choice was being offered to all of us. Every thought, every action, every word we choose could tip the scales between light and dark. "What do you think we should do?" asked Zane, ever the strategist. "We need to help people understand that this battle is spiritual," I responded. "Preparedness isn't just about stockpiling food or building shelter. It's about strengthening the spirit, seeking love, forgiveness, and compassion." That night, we did our first live broadcast with this new focus. It was no longer just about predictions and natural disasters, but about how humanity could protect itself spiritually. We share prayers, guided meditations, and stories of spiritual overcoming, and as we spoke, I felt as if the shadows around me were beginning to recede, if only a little. The spiritual battle was just beginning, and I knew the next few days would be decisive. The following days were a true test of faith and endurance. As March progressed, the world seemed to be falling apart. News of natural disasters emerged every hour. Floods ravaged coastal cities, fires consumed entire forests, and earthquakes shook regions that had never recorded seismic shocks before. But what scared the most was not just the physical events, but human behavior. It seemed as if a shadow had settled in people's hearts. Reasonless fights, street violence, and a general sense of despair took over communities. I felt the weight of it all. Each piece of news seemed to echo the visions I had in the spiritual corridor. The sense of urgency was growing, and the live streams we did with Zane Waverly became more and more intense. People around the world shared their own experiences, dreams of spiritual battles, encounters with beings of light, and even visions of the dark entity trying to influence them. Ella McCree has organized prayer and meditation groups not just locally but on video calls with people from different countries. It was as if we were trying to build a network of light to resist the growing darkness. Dean Harper, the sheriff, used his position to help keep order in the small town of Whitefish, but even he began to realize that what we faced was beyond what any gun or law could solve. One particularly difficult night, I woke up in a cold sweat. The vision was so intense that it took me a few minutes to discern what was real. I had seen spiritual warfare up close. Beings of light formed a barrier, protecting children and the elderly while the dark entity crawled across the ground, its claws digging into the earth, spreading poison. But there was something more. I saw ordinary people like me, emanating their own light, driving away darkness with just their presence. They were those who chose love, forgiveness, and compassion. The next morning, I shared this vision with the group. The real battle is not between angels and demons, but within each of us, I explained. The choice for light needs to be made every day, in every thought and action. Only then will we have a chance. That night's live broadcast was different. There was no longer fear in my voice, but rather hope. We led a collective meditation, and as thousands of people around the world closed their eyes and connected to the light within, I felt as if the spiritual corridor was there, among us. The shadows receded a little further, and for the first time in a long time, the silence that followed was not one of fear, but of peace. March still had many days ahead, and I knew that the hardest moments were yet to come. But now, there was a spark, and sometimes all you need to drive away the darkness is a little light. The last days of March arrived like a final storm, a culmination of everything we had predicted. The world seemed trapped in an endless cycle of chaos. While floods and fires dominated the headlines, something even deeper was happening in the silence of souls. People reported feeling a dark presence, a sense of despair that appeared out of nowhere. Others said they heard whispers when they were alone, as if the darkness itself was trying to envelop them. In the small town of Whitefish, where it all began, we met in an old church. It was not a conventional meeting. There were no priests or traditional rituals, just ordinary people seeking something greater. Ella McCree led the prayers, her soft but firm voice guiding us all into a state of peace. Sheriff Dean Harper kept the doors open, allowing anyone to enter regardless of their beliefs or disbeliefs. During this meeting, a warm feeling spread throughout the room. It wasn't the kind of heat that comes from heaters or human contact, but a presence. Some started crying. Others just closed their eyes and took deep breaths. I knew what was happening. The spiritual corridor was there, between us. And then, it happened. It was as if time stopped. We all feel a change, a pressure in the air. I looked around and saw figures of light, not just around us, but between us. They were not distant and unattainable beings, but ordinary people who, in their moments of greatest compassion, shone with a light of their own. Ella was one of those lights. I saw her face light up, and she seemed to float, even though her feet were firmly on the ground. But darkness also arrived. The dark entity, that reptilian and distorted presence, seemed to infiltrate the shadows of the church. The air became heavy, the environment cold. Some people fell to their knees, overcome by fear. I heard whispers, promises of power, of revenge, of instant satisfaction. They were the same words I had heard in the spiritual hall. But then, Something changed. A child, no more than 7 years old, stood up. Her name was Lucy, the daughter of a couple who had driven hours to attend the meeting. She simply walked to the center of the room and began to sing a children's song, something so simple and pure that it cut through the silence like a blade. Her thin but sweet voice seemed to repel the darkness. People started to join her. One by one, voices rose, some singing, others just repeating words of love and hope. The darkness hesitated, and I saw, with my soul's eyes, the dark entity shrink. It was not the physical confrontation we expected, but rather a battle of frequencies, where the light and sound of each good intention drove away the shadow. At the end of that night, the world had not been magically saved. The disasters continued, the difficulties remained, but the spiritual battle had found a new balance. The darkness had not won, and the light, although small, shone brighter. I knew the journey was far from over, but now there was hope, and sometimes hope is all you need to start rebuilding the world. When the sun rose the next morning, something seemed different. The air was lighter, the sky clearer. The clouds that hung heavy over Whitefish had cleared, revealing an intense blue I hadn't seen in months. The people who had been at the church meeting were still there, some sleeping in the pews, others in silent prayer. There was a serenity that seemed disproportionate to the chaos still unfolding around the world. The news continued to be frightening. Floods on distant continents, fires that could not be contained, unexpected earthquakes. But among the tragedies, reports of small miracles emerged. In a village devastated by water, a child was found alive in an air bubble. In a city surrounded by fire, flames broke out around a group praying, and amid the rubble of an earthquake, survivors were guided by voices they couldn't explain. Zane Waverly wasted no time. He compiled these reports, transforming each story into a message of hope. His podcast, once niche and aimed at conspiracy theorists, became a beacon for those seeking greater meaning. People from all over the world shared their own experiences, and the message spread. The light was winning, even if little by little. Ella McCree organized new meetings, not just in Whitefish, but also online, connecting people from different countries. Sheriff Dean Harper, once a skeptic, was now a passionate supporter of the cause. He organized support groups, helping those who felt lost and vulnerable. His local authority brought a sense of security, and many in the city began to see spiritual warfare with new eyes. I became a kind of spiritual guide, something I never imagined for my life. People came to me, not seeking concrete answers, but guidance on how to strengthen their souls. And I did what I could, sharing my story, leading meditations, and most of all, listening. Often, it was the simple act of listening that brought more comfort than any words. As the days passed, it became clear that the spiritual battle was not over, but the worst seemed to be over. The world still faced immense challenges, but there was a subtle shift in the way people responded to them. Less fear, more compassion. Less hate, more understanding. It was as if humanity, as a whole, had taken a small step towards the light. And then, when March finally came to an end, the world seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. It was not the apocalypse that many expected, but a silent, almost imperceptible transformation. I knew there was still a lot to do, but I also knew I wasn't alone. There was a network of light connecting people everywhere, and that was the real victory. I continued my journey, no longer as an end-times prophet, but as a messenger of hope. The spiritual battle was still going on, but now, each of us knew what to do. Choose the light, every day. As March came to an end, the sense of urgency gave way to reflective silence. Although natural disasters still occurred, the world seemed to have crossed an invisible line. The news, previously dominated by chaos and destruction, began to highlight stories of overcoming, everyday miracles and acts of kindness that appeared in the most unlikely places. I continued my mission. Live streams with Zane Waverly became a rallying point for those seeking to not only understand what had happened, but also how to move forward. Our small virtual community has grown, and what started as a group of curious and skeptical people has turned into a global network of spiritual support. Ella McCree became a key figure in this process. His ability to connect people and his natural empathy have helped many deal with their fears and doubts. She organized collective meditations and created small groups for prayer and reflection. People reported that during these meetings they felt a deep peace, as if they were touching that light that we had all seen in the spiritual corridor. Sheriff Dean Harper, in turn, dedicated himself to transforming Whitefish into a model caring community. He started mutual aid programs, where neighbors supported each other, not only in practical but also spiritual matters. His personal transformation, from a skeptical, pragmatic man to someone who understood the importance of spiritual preparation, inspired many around him. I kept having visions, but now they were different. No more apocalyptic scenes or intense spiritual battle. Instead, I saw ordinary people choosing love in difficult times, a mother forgiving her son's attacker, a young man helping an elderly man to get up after a fall, a group of strangers joining forces to save animals during a flood, small acts of light that together formed a barrier against the darkness. One night during one of our live broadcasts, a woman with a shaky voice joined the call. "I've been on the brink," she said, "but I heard your story, Gideon, and it gave me strength to choose life, to choose the light." That moment crystallized everything for me. It wasn't just about avoiding the physical apocalypse, but about transforming people's hearts, to help each person see that the choice for light was possible, even in the darkest moments. When I ended that broadcast, I felt a lightness that I hadn't experienced in a long time. The spiritual corridor was still there, but now, instead of a place of judgment and prophecy, it had become a path of renewal and purpose. I knew the work was just beginning, but for the first time, I felt confident that the world was moving in the right direction, not because of the absence of challenges, but because of the presence of conscious choice for light. Every day, the following months brought a new reality. Although the world still faced challenges, there was a sense that something had fundamentally changed. Communities began to rebuild, not just physically but spiritually. The fear that once dominated every news story and every conversation was gradually replaced by a genuine desire for connection and understanding. In Whitefish, the small group we started at the local church became a movement. People from other cities and even other countries began to visit, trying to understand what we had done there. There were no secrets or magic formulas, just the daily practice of choosing the light. Meditation meetings, support groups, community events that encouraged forgiveness and compassion. All of this created a positive energy field that seemed to repel darkness. I became a traveling messenger. With the support of Ella McCree, Zane Waverly, and Sheriff Dean Harper, I began traveling to other cities, sharing my story and encouraging people to create their own networks of light. Each city had its own way of welcoming the message. In some way, religious groups embraced the idea and integrated it into their practices. In others, secular communities have found ways to apply spiritual principles in everyday life, promoting kindness and mutual care. My visions were now softer. I still saw the spiritual corridor, but it was no longer a place of judgment or terror. It was an illuminated path where I could see souls connecting, lights turning on in different parts of the world. The dark entity still existed, but it seemed more distant, like a shadow without its own strength. On one of my trips, a woman approached me after a talk. His face was marked by suffering, but there was a spark of hope in his eyes. "I was lost," she said. But as I listened to her story, I realized there is always a choice. And today, I chose the light. These moments showed me that although I was not a savior or prophet, my role as a messenger was important. Not to bring answers, but to remind people that they had the power to decide the path they wanted to take. As the year 2025 progressed, the world seemed to be in a healing process. It wasn't perfect, and challenges still arose, but the difference was in people's responses. There was less hate, less rush to judge, and more willingness to listen and help. And so, the man who was once just a skeptical truck driver became part of something much bigger, not as a leader, but as a witness to the transformative power of light. And whenever they asked how it all started, I simply replied, "I died and came back to warn the world. And now, I'm here to live and learn from it." Time ran its course, and the year 2025 brought with it a mix of challenges and renewals. Around the world, natural disasters continued to occur, but people's responses seemed different. There was not only physical, but spiritual preparation. Spiritual support groups have sprung up in many communities, inspired by the message we share. It was not a new religion, but a movement to raise awareness about the importance of choosing the light daily. I continued my travels, now with a clearer purpose. It was no longer about warning about the apocalypse, but about strengthening people's hearts and minds so that, when darkness came, they would have the strength to resist. Each city I visited seemed to have its own way of interpreting the message. Some created community gardens, where collective work helped rebuild ties. Others organized collective meditations in public squares, bringing a sense of peace even to those who happened to pass by. Ella McCree became a spiritual leadership figure. Her genuine faith and ability to connect with people have made her a guide to many. While I traveled, she remained in Whitefish, keeping the flame burning in the local community. His work helped the city become a living example of what was possible when light was chosen day after day. Sheriff Dean Harper, in turn, has found a new calling. He began training other police officers and law enforcement officers on how to deal with spiritual and emotional crises, promoting not only physical safety, but also mental and spiritual well-being. His transformation from a pragmatic skeptic to a spiritual guardian was one of the most inspiring stories I have witnessed. And then there was Zane Waverly. His podcast became a global platform where people from different parts of the world shared their own spiritual experiences. Stories of encounters with beings of light, of moments of decision between fear and love, of small victories over inner shadows. Each report contributed to strengthening the network of light that spread across the planet. As for me, I continued to have visions, but now, instead of disasters and battles, he saw a world rebuilding. I saw people helping each other, communities flourishing, and, above all, an increasingly distant darkness, weakened by the collective choice of light. One night, during a meeting in a country town, a child approached me. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity, and she held a small sketchbook. "I dreamed of you," she said. "In my dream, you were in a place full of light, and everyone was smiling." Those words moved me deeply. They were proof that the future was not just in visions of destruction, but in the seeds of hope planted in every heart. The spiritual corridor I feared so much had become a path of light, where each choice for kindness and compassion paved the way for us all. And so I continued my journey, no longer as the man who predicted the apocalypse, but as someone who, when he died, learned the true value of life. And my mission was simple: share this truth with everyone who would listen. As time went on, I realized that my mission was not just to warn the world of what was coming, but also to help people find their own inner light. The spiritual corridor, which once seemed a place of judgment and prophecy, now revealed itself as a path of learning and transformation. Every time he closed his eyes, I saw myself there again, but now he was guided not by fear, but by hope. My visions became less apocalyptic and more inspiring. I saw children growing up in communities where love and compassion were practiced daily. I saw families rebuilding their lives after disasters, not just with material help, but with renewed spiritual strength. The darkness still existed, but it seemed weakened, almost irrelevant in the face of the brightness emanating from humanity. Ella McCree continued to be my partner on this journey. Together, we began to organize spiritual gatherings that did not have religious labels, but that welcomed all who sought a greater purpose. Whitefish became a refuge for those who needed to reconnect with their essence. Meetings at the local church grew so much that we had to move to a larger space, where hundreds of people met weekly to share their stories, pray, meditate, and strengthen the network of light. Sheriff Dean Harper went further. Inspired by the changes he saw in the community, he began promoting training for police forces in other cities. His approach blended physical safety with spiritual care, helping other officers see beyond crime and violence, understanding that these were often just symptoms of an inner darkness. His transformation inspired even the most hardened, showing that no one was beyond redemption. Zane Waverly, with his podcast, took our message to the world. His show became a space where people shared their own spiritual experiences. With each episode, more and more stories emerged, coming from different cultures, religions, and origins. What they all had in common was the choice for light. No matter the language or belief, the message was universal: the power of compassion, forgiveness, and love. As for me, I continued traveling. My mission was clear: to strengthen those who found a path to transformation in the spiritual corridor. It was no longer about predicting the end of the world, but rather helping each person face their own spiritual battles. I knew that the real war was not against an external dark entity, but against the shadows that each of us carried within ourselves. Once, while visiting a small town in the Midwest, I was approached by an elderly man. His eyes shone with a mixture of wisdom and sadness. "I saw you in the hallway," he said. I thought I was going crazy, but now I know I was just waking up. That moment was yet another reminder that my experience was not unique. The spiritual corridor was a place where we all, in some way, passed through critical moments in our lives. The difference was in how we chose to respond to it. And my mission was to help as many people as possible respond with light. At the end of each day, when I closed my eyes, I saw myself again on that path of ancient stones. But now it was full of lights. They were the souls who had found their own truth, who had chosen love, and who were now helping to light the way for others. And so I continued my journey, no longer as a prophet of the end, but as a messenger of hope, reminding everyone that the true apocalypse was not the end of the world, but the rebirth of our souls. As time passed, the impact of the message of light and hope began to reverberate far beyond Whitefish's borders. The small movement we started turned into a global movement, where people from different cultures and religions found a common point: the conscious choice for light. It was not about avoiding the apocalypse, but about building a new way of living, where love and compassion guided daily actions. Zane Waverley's live streams have reached millions of people. In each episode, stories of spiritual transformation were shared. A woman in India recounted how, while meditating during a thunderstorm, she saw figures of light guiding her family to safety. A man in Brazil told of a dream where darkness tried to consume him, but he was saved by reciting words of forgiveness. These stories, coming from different corners of the world, confirmed that the spiritual battle was not just mine, but that of all humanity. Ella McCree became a spiritual reference. She traveled with me on many of our missions, but also led local programs in Whitefish. Her natural empathy made her a unique spiritual guide, someone who did not impose beliefs, but opened space for each person to find their own path. I saw children transformed by his guidance, families reconciled, and entire communities finding a new way of living. Sheriff Dean Harper continued his work, bringing his spiritual care approach to other police forces. His message was clear: it is not enough to protect the physical body, it is also necessary to take care of the soul. He trained police officers to deal with spiritual and emotional crises, helping them see beyond behavior, understanding the pain and trauma that often guided people's actions. Gideon Rourke, skeptical truck driver turned spiritual messenger, continued my journey. In each city I visited, I met people who had already heard about light. They no longer needed to be convinced, just reminded that they had the power to choose every day. My mission was simple: plant seeds of hope and allow everyone to find their own way to make the light grow. On one of my trips, I met a young woman named Maya. She had lost everything in a flood: her home, her family, her sense of purpose. But upon hearing my story, something changed. "If you can come back from death and find the light, so can I," she said, with tears in her eyes. And, little by little, she began helping other people at risk, becoming a leader in her community. At the end of each day, when I closed my eyes, I still saw the spiritual corridor. But now, instead of a place of mystery and prophecy, it was a path filled with lights, each representing a soul who had chosen love. The dark entity still existed, but it was just a distant shadow, without the power it once seemed to have. The real victory was not in defeating darkness, but in getting more people to choose the light. As 2025 came to an end, I looked back and saw how much the world had changed. It was not a magical or immediate transformation, but an ongoing process, where each small choice for kindness contributed to the greater good. I knew my journey was far from over, but I also knew I was no longer alone. The light had spread, and where before there was only darkness, there was now a constellation of souls shining, each lighting the way for the others. I continued, no longer as an end-times prophet, but as a messenger of hope. And each time I shared my story, I felt the spiritual corridor closer, not as an end, but as a reminder that true eternity was in the way we lived each day, always choosing the light. As 2026 began, the world seemed to be in a time of transition. Natural disasters continued to happen, but they were now accompanied by a more compassionate and organized human response. Communities, once fragmented, began to come together, not just to rebuild homes and streets, but to rebuild hearts and minds. There was a growing sense that we were all on this spiritual journey together, and that each choice for light contributed to the collective good. I continued my mission, traveling to different cities, meeting people who had been touched by the message of light and hope, Each encounter brought a new story, new proof that the spiritual battle was being won little by little. I especially remember a visit to the state of Louisiana. There, an entire community had mobilized after a devastating flood. Instead of succumbing to despair, they created support centers where material help was accompanied by spiritual guidance. During an outdoor lecture, under the still cloudy sky, a white-haired lady called me. His voice was soft, but it carried an indescribable strength. "I saw the hallway too," she said, her blue eyes seeming to see beyond the physical. "But I wasn't afraid. I knew it was just a passage, not an end." His words resonated with me. It was further confirmation that the spiritual corridor was not exclusive, but rather a universal experience. In Whitefish, Ella McCree continued her spiritual leadership. The city had become a reference point, not only for those looking for answers, but also for those who wanted to contribute. Doctors, therapists, community leaders. Everyone came together to create a space where the body, mind, and spirit were cared for holistically. Children, especially, seemed more connected to the light. Many of them reported dreams of beings of light, visions of peace, and a wisdom that transcended their ages. Sheriff Dean Harper has expanded his work. Now he lectured to other police forces, helping to spread his approach to spiritual security. His transformation was an inspiration. He, who previously believed only in the concrete and practical, now spoke openly about the importance of faith, compassion, and care for the soul. Zane Waverly, always the natural communicator, took the movement to a new level. His podcast evolved into a multimedia platform where people from different parts of the world shared their stories. He organized online conferences, connecting people who would otherwise never have the chance to meet. The stories that emerged from these conferences were living proof that the light was winning. As for me, I continued to walk around the world as a messenger, no longer just warning about the apocalypse, but showing that the true apocalypse was rebirth. Every time I met someone who had been touched by the light, I felt as if the spiritual corridor widened, lit up a little more. The path of ancient stones now seemed like a golden road, where every step was guided by love. One night, while alone in a hotel room, I was overcome by an intense vision. I saw the spiritual hall again, but this time, it was full of people. They walked in the same direction, their forms made of pure light. There were children, elderly people, men and women of all cultures and backgrounds, and at the end of the hallway, a light shone brighter than anything I had ever seen. A voice echoed, soft and familiar. "You have fulfilled your purpose, Gideon. But the journey continues, not just for you, but for all who have chosen the light." I woke up with a deep peace. I knew my mission was not over, but I also knew that the weight I carried was now shared by many. The world still had much to face, but now, each soul who chose the light became a beacon, helping to guide others. And so, I continued, no longer as the skeptical truck driver, but as someone who, upon dying, learned the true value of life. And as long as there was darkness, I would keep walking, carrying with me the certainty that, even in the deepest night, the light would always find a way to shine. As the movement of light continued to grow, the world began to show visible signs of transformation. Headlines, once full of tragedy and chaos, began to give way to stories of resilience, everyday miracles, and unexpected acts of kindness. It was as if humanity was collectively awakening to a new level of consciousness. In Whitefish, the spiritual center led by Ella McCree has become a model for other communities. People from different parts of the world came not only to listen to the lectures and participate in the meditations, but also to share their own experiences. The small town, once just a dot on the map, has become a symbol of spiritual rebirth. Visitors spoke of a feeling of peace upon setting foot there, as if the earth itself had absorbed the light radiated by the people. Dean Harper continued his tireless work, now traveling to train police forces in different states. His practical approach, mixed with a deep spiritual understanding, helped transform the way authorities dealt with crises. He created rehabilitation programs that not only helped people get back on their feet physically, but also spiritually. Many of those who have gone through his guidance report having experienced the spiritual corridor, always in moments of choosing between light and darkness. Zane Waverly expanded his platform. His podcast became a global network where stories of spiritual experiences were shared daily. He organized virtual meetings, connecting people from different cultures, and these meetings often brought to light profound revelations. During one of these transmissions, A woman from Australia reported how, during a meditation, she saw a vision of spiritual battle, but contrary to what many expected, the victory of light did not come through force, but through acceptance, through inner peace. I continued traveling. Now, my mission was to take the message of light to the places where the shadows still resisted. I went to prisons, where incarcerated men and women found redemption by understanding that true freedom came from the soul. I went to hospitals, where terminally ill patients found comfort in realizing that the spiritual corridor was not the end, but just a passage. I went to disaster zones, where those who had lost everything physically discovered they could still save their souls. During one of these visits, I met a young woman named Sarah. She was staying at a shelter for victims of a recent earthquake. His eyes, despite everything he had lost, still shined. She approached me and held my hand. "I know I'll be fine," she said, "because last night I dreamed about the hallway, and there was light, lots of light." These moments reminded me that my mission was actually simple: to be a witness to the light and help others see it in themselves. I wasn't a savior, just someone who was lucky enough to come back from death with a message of hope. And as long as there were people willing to listen, I would keep talking. At the end of each day, when I retired to rest, I closed my eyes and saw the spiritual corridor. But now, it was no longer empty. There was a procession of souls, each carrying their own light, walking together towards eternity. I knew my journey wasn't over yet, but I also knew I was on the right path, and so I followed my mission, no longer as a prophet of the apocalypse, but as a messenger of the new age. And with each story shared, each soul touched, the world became a little brighter, because, in the end, the true victory of the light was not over the outer darkness, but over the shadows that each of us carried within. As the years passed, the movement of light continued to spread, transcending cultural, religious, and social barriers. It was no longer just a message I carried, but a truth lived by millions around the world. The seeds planted in Whitefish blossomed into entire communities, creating a spiritual support network that embraced all those seeking inner peace and connection with the divine. My life turned into a constant pilgrimage. I was invited to speak at spiritual conferences, community centers, and even in unexpected places like military bases and prisons. In each place, I found people who, in some way, had experienced the spiritual corridor. Many reported dreams, visions, or moments of near death in which they were faced with the same path of ancient stones and the choice between light and darkness. Ella McCree became one of the movement's most respected leaders. She published books, organized spiritual retreats, and helped create a curriculum that was taught in schools and universities. His focus was always the same: teaching people to live consciously, choosing love, forgiveness, and compassion in every everyday decision. Under his leadership, Whitefish became a beacon of light, welcoming visitors from around the world. Dean Harper, the sheriff, retired from the police force but never stopped serving. He created a foundation dedicated to training community leaders, helping them bring the message of light to places where fear and violence still persist. His personal journey from skeptic to spiritual guardian has inspired many to follow the same path. He often said, "I haven't carried a gun in years, but I've never felt so safe, because now I know that true safety comes from the soul." Zane Waverly, with his unique communication skills, took the message to new heights. His multimedia platform grew exponentially, and he began producing documentaries, educational programs, and live events. He became a bridge between different cultures, showing that the choice for light was not exclusive to one belief or religion, but a universal calling. As for me, I remained just Gideon Rourke, the truck driver who died and came back to share a message. My mission has evolved. Now I was not just telling my story, but helping others discover theirs. I traveled to distant countries, sat next to people I never imagined meeting, and heard stories that touched the soul. Each story was a reminder that the spiritual corridor was not an exclusive place, but an experience accessible to all who were open to transformation. On one of these journeys, I went to Japan, where I met a Buddhist monk who had also experienced the spiritual corridor. Despite our different cultures and languages, we spoke the same soul language. He took me to an ancient temple in the mountains, where we meditated together. During this meditation, I had a clear vision. I saw the spiritual corridor completely illuminated, its stone walls now shining with a golden light. The souls that walked there were no longer alone. They held hands, walking together towards the brightest light on the horizon. I woke up from that meditation with tears in my eyes. I knew my mission was evolving. It was no longer just about sharing my own experience, but about helping each person connect with the divine within themselves. True spiritual warfare was not just a choice between light and darkness, but an ongoing journey to keep that light burning, even in the darkest moments. When I returned to Whitefish, I was greeted with warm hugs. The city had transformed, not just physically, but spiritually. There was peace in the streets, laughter in the parks, and a sense of community that was almost palpable. I walked to the old church where it all began and sat down on one of the wooden benches. I closed my eyes and, once again, I found myself in the spiritual corridor. But this time, I wasn't being pulled or pushed. I was simply there at peace, knowing that no matter where my journey took me, I would always be on the path to light. And so, I continued my mission, no longer as a man trying to save the world, but as a soul sharing his light, a spark in the midst of an infinite universe of possibilities. Because, in the end, the true victory of the light was not over the outer darkness, but over the shadows that each of us carried within. And in choosing the light, we discovered that eternity was not just at the end of the hallway, but in every step taken with love and purpose along the way. Years passed, and the world continued its journey of transformation. The message of light has taken deep root, not as a religion or doctrine, but as a daily choice. People began to see the value of inner silence, meditation, and prayer, regardless of their beliefs. Entire communities reorganized, making spiritual well-being a priority, and the impact of this was visible in every aspect of everyday life. In Whitefish, the spiritual center founded by Ella McCree has become a true sanctuary. People came from all corners of the world, seeking not only spiritual healing but also direction in their lives. Ella, always welcoming, led retreats where silence was respected and souls found space to flourish. She said, "Light is not just a destination, but the path itself. Each step taken with love strengthens the journey." Dean Harper, even in retirement, remained active in the community. He founded programs for at-risk youth, offering not only practical guidance but spiritual insight into life. His foundation grew and began operating in several cities, bringing spiritual safety training to places where violence and fear still persisted. His message was clear: true protection came not from weapons, but from the heart. Zane Waverly has become a global voice. His program expanded into a full-fledged media network where documentaries, lectures, and stories of spiritual experiences were shared daily. He promoted international meetings, bringing together spiritual leaders from different cultures and beliefs, always with the same purpose: to promote light and combat inner shadows. His ability to communicate spiritual truths in an accessible way has touched millions of lives. As for me, I continued my pilgrimage. My mission has evolved beyond sharing my near-death experience. Now, I helped others understand their own spiritual journeys. I participated in meetings in small communities and in large conferences, but my message remained the same. The spiritual corridor was available to everyone. You just had to open your heart and choose the light. While visiting Mexico, I met a Mayan elder named Nicanor. He took me to an ancient ruin where we shared stories under the starry sky. "The spiritual corridor you speak of," he said, "we call it the path of the ancestors. It is where the soul finds its true essence." His words reinforced what I already felt. My experience was not unique. The spiritual corridor was a universal archetype, present in different cultures and spiritual traditions throughout history. Natural disasters did not disappear, but the way the world faced them was different. Where there was once panic and despair, now there was unity and solidarity. Where shadows tried to sow fear, light flourished through small daily acts of kindness. It was as if humanity had finally found its balance, understanding that the true spiritual battle was fought in everyday life, in seemingly small choices that, when added together, changed the world. In one such moment, sitting by a lake in Whitefish, I felt a deep peace. I closed my eyes and found myself in the spiritual corridor again, but this time I wasn't walking alone. All around me, thousands of souls walked beside me, their lights forming a brilliant river that flowed toward the golden horizon. I was no longer a lone messenger. I had found my tribe, my spiritual family, and together we walked, not to escape this world, but to enlighten it. And so, I moved forward, always with an open heart and feet firmly on the path of light, because the biggest lesson I learned was that the true purpose of life was not to achieve enlightenment, but to share that light with everyone around me. And as long as there was someone willing to listen, I would keep telling my story, knowing that each word could ignite a new flame, making the world shine a little brighter. If you like this beautiful spiritual testimony, leave a like, comment on your impressions, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to activate the notification bell to watch each new video and help us spread this message to a greater number of people. Until next time.